The joint hearing of the Subcommittee on Oversight and the Subcommittee on the Middle East will come to order. I'd like to thank my distinguished colleague, Chairman Ackerman, for agreeing to this joint hearing. And on behalf of myself and my good friend, the ranking member from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, I welcome the gentleman from New York and his distinguished ranking member, Mr. Pence, whom I understand is on his way. I would also note the presence of the gentle lady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, who has introduced legislation dealing with the subject of this hearing. And I ask unanimous consent that she and any other member attending today's hearing be permitted to act as a member of the subcommittee for the purpose of taking testimony and asking questions. And hearing no objection, so ordered. The multitude of potential commitments embraced by the so-called Declaration of Principles signed by President Bush and Prime Minister Maliki on November 22nd of last year have profound consequences for the United States and the American people. This hearing will, in part, examine those proposed commitments and assess whether congressional approval is required in order for them to become legally binding. However, let me be perfectly clear. The White House should be on notice that as a prerequisite to any agreement, making the kind of commitments enumerated in the Declaration of Principles, Congress must be an integral part of the discussions and negotiations from the beginning. And what we have heard from the administration regarding the process by which the United States would make such momentous commitments. Well, the only comment to date has come from a response to a question at a press conference by General Douglas Lute, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan. General Lute said that he does not, and these are his words, anticipate now that these negotiations will lead to the status of a formal treaty, which would then bring us to formal negotiations or formal inputs from the Congress. I, for one, could not disagree more. Where have we ever entered an agreement to defend a foreign country from external and internal attack that was not a treaty? This could very well implicate our military forces in a full-blown civil war in Iraq. If a commitment of this magnitude does not rise to the level of a treaty, then it is difficult to imagine what could. Now, I have tremendous respect for General Lute. He and his family have served this country well, and that is why I invited him, as well as other witnesses from the Defense and State Departments, to be here today to explain the administration's position. But I'm cognizant of the fact that General Lute is a soldier and not an international treaty attorney, and that there are others above his pay grade that are responsible for ultimate decisions. It should be noted for the record that in addition to General Lute, invitations to this hearing were extended to Eric Edelman, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Bellinger III, the State Department Legal Advisor, and Ambassador David Satterfield, the State Department Special Coordinator for Iraq. all 4 invitations were declined. Now, many of us are aware of the propensity of this administration to interpret and expand executive power to a point never contemplated by the Founding Fathers. The voluminous so-called signing statements issued by the White House are testimony to that attitude. Senator Hagel, our Republican colleague in the other body, has said that during the run-up to vote to authorize the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration considered Congress to be, and again, these are his words, an enemy and a constitutional nuisance. Well, this is a different Congress. I find it particularly disturbing that the Bush administration has even ignored State Department regulations requiring that, and again, this is language excerpted from their regulations. The appropriate congressional leaders and committees are advised of the intention to negotiate significant new international agreements, consulted concerning such agreements, and kept informed of developments affecting them, including especially where any legislation is considered necessary or desirable for the implementation of a treaty or agreement. These regulations specifically state that when it comes to questions about whether or not an agreement is to be considered a treaty, consultations are to be held with Congress in which, and again, this is language taken from the State Department regulations, every practical effort will be made to identify such questions at the earliest possible date so that consultations may be completed in sufficient time to avoid last-minute considerations. I've inquired of our leadership on this committee and the House leadership, and I can find no evidence that any of this has occurred. This is disturbing, for considerable American blood and treasure have been invested in this war, a war that has devastated Iraq, divided America, diminished how we are viewed by the rest of the world, as well as jeopardized our reputation for decency and the rule of law. And if you have any doubts about the war's impact on our economy, check your stock market portfolio. As I said before, this is a different Congress. Not just the Bush administration, but the Maliki government must understand that reality, and that Congress has a constitutional role to play in international agreements of such a magnitude, and that we intend to ensure that our constitutional prerogatives are fully respected. Furthermore, we are not unaware that many respected experts on Iraq have characterized the Maliki government as dysfunctional and beset by corruption and factionalism. Our hearing in December elicited testimony that the Maliki government secured the extension of the UN mandate, which serves as the legal basis for U.S. troops to occupy and engage in combat in Iraq, without receiving the consent of the Iraqi parliament, despite assurances to the contrary. We encourage the Maliki government to engage the Iraqi parliament fully in deliberations on the so-called Declaration of Principles. For we recognize that the parliament is the only directly elected body in the nascent democracy in Iraq. Before I introduce our witnesses, let me turn to my ranking member and the chairman and the ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee, as well as our guest, the gentle lady from Connecticut, And I note that we are joined by a member of the Middle East Subcommittee, Mr. Scott, as well, for any opening remarks they care to make, and the gentle lady from California who has also joined us, Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Rohrabacher.
Yes, we are surrounded by chairmen today.
This is Chairman's Day.
There we go, right there.
Ooh, you got it. You're gonna have to drop down.
All right. I'm just going to distance myself from the chairman.
This is a Judiciary Committee trip, not a Foreign Affairs.
Now, I don't want any of you to mistake me with Ron Paul because of the sign here. Mr. Chairman, welcome back, and it is always an interesting and I might say pleasant experience for those of us who like to play mental chess, coming to hearings under your leadership 2 months ago. Today, when we're talking, of course, about something that started 2 months ago when President Bush and Prime Minister al-Maliki signed a document called the Declaration of Principles for Long-Term Relationship of Cooperation and Friendship between the Republic of Iraq and the United States of America. And that pact states that by July 31st of this year, Iraq and the United States will have an agreement that will detail the relationship between our two countries. The Declaration of Principles makes it clear that such an agreement will involve a commitment on the part of the United States to defend Iraq against internal or external attack on its security and its democratic government. The question that we will address in today's hearing is, does such an agreement rise to the level of a treaty, which would need the ratification, legally require the ratification, by the United States Senate, as well as the Council of Representatives in Iraq? Or would this simply be a bilateral agreement and thus solely an executive branch function? So we are talking about the legal realities, which would mandate certain legal prerequisites in terms of actions taken by the legislative branch versus the executive branch. Let me note I will be looking closely at what we're hearing today in terms of the argumentation on this specific issue. And I think it is it's good that you brought this up, and it's something that we need to discuss, especially considering the nature of governance of this particular administration. Let me just note that I believe that this administration has been arrogant. I am a Republican, and at times I am embarrassed by the lack of cooperation that this president and his appointees have had with the legislative branch. I sat in that chair just a few months ago, and the lack of cooperation that we had with various leaders from this administration was overwhelming. There is a seething resentment by members of Congress who are Republicans by the fact that this administration has not even cooperated with us, much less with you, who represents another party. There are ways of doing things, and there are other ways of doing things, and I think this administration has had its share of arrogance, and it's something that breeds the type of discussions that are necessary today. We have to look with a magnifying glass at what the legal prerequisites are, because we don't have a spirit of cooperation. And I cannot tell you how many times we've had to make requests on investigations over the time period when I was chairman of this subcommittee and got no cooperation whatsoever and got nothing but roadblocks in the way of those investigations. That does not lead one to have faith in the descriptions that are given to us secondhand and third-hand and assurances given to us by senior members of this administration. However, with that said, let me note that I do reject the notion that Congress has not been involved in the debate over what our Iraq policy should be. There have been numerous votes, numerous hearings such as this one. In the United States Senate, there was vote after vote that has failed in an attempt by the majority party in the Senate to remove American personnel, military personnel from Iraq. I would suggest that the minute that it is possible for us to withdraw our troops, meaning that the Iraqi people are capable of defending themselves, we should do so. And if there is any suggestion that there is a long-term commitment by the United States to send our military personnel back to Iraq or to do the fighting for the Iraqi people themselves, which is what's happening now, and hopefully we're winding that down, and the Iraqi people who believe in more democratic society will step up and are stepping up to handle that responsibility. But the minute they can do that, we should be out of there, and they should be doing their own fighting, and that they should not feel that the United States is on call to send our young people and our treasure and put the blood of our young people and our treasure at their disposal. So with that said, I am very anxious to hear the witnesses today, and I am also jealous of the prerogatives of the legislative branch, as we all should be, because we are here to fulfill the constitutional role that was established by our founding fathers and the responsibilities that have, of course, been given to us by the voters of this country to represent their interests. And it is not all in the hands of the President and his appointees. We play a major role, and as I say, if there would have been a better spirit, perhaps examining the legal prerequisites would not be as important discussion. So thank you very much for this hearing today, and I look forward to participating fully.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. And now the chair of the Middle East Subcommittee, Mr. Ackerman of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please do not misinterpret my sliding further away from you as an indication of any disagreement. It appears that the microphone on either side of you have both failed. I appreciate Mr. Rohrabacher's statement as well. He proves yet again that he is an equal opportunity attack dog. I think the very fact that this is a joint hearing of both subcommittees is indicative of the fact that this is a very important area of concern to so many members of Congress. The war in Iraq remains deeply unpopular with most Americans, as a review of any number of recent polls will tell you, or perhaps simply a review of the mail that comes into your office would suggest. So it strikes me as unwise that the President would want to go ahead and unilaterally commit the United States to a long-term security agreement with Iraq without trying to get the support of either the American people or the people's representatives. But true to form, the President has decided to go it alone on Iraq again. Or so one would believe if you take the President's Special Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan, General Douglas Lute, at his word, as you point out, Chairman Delahunt. General Lute made it clear that the White House would be flying solo on this question when he said, quote, "We don't anticipate now that these negotiations will lead to a formal treaty, which would then bring to formal negotiations or formal inputs from the Congress," unquote. I don't think we can dispute General Lute's view that the President certainly has the authority to enter into an executive agreement with the government of Iraq. Certainly such agreements are a commonly used tool in American diplomacy, and such agreements are not ordinarily subject to congressional approval unless there are U.S. domestic laws that need to be amended in order for our nation to comply with the agreement. No, the issue isn't a question of legal authority, it's a question of political wisdom and sustainability. And I think the President's preferred course, as expressed by General Lute, is profoundly unwise and unsustainable. Americans in vast numbers want our troops to come home. They're no longer certain if they ever were what we are fighting for. But I also think that most Americans, if you ask them, would agree that even after the U.S. withdraws its forces from Iraq, we still need a framework for our relations with Iraq from that point forward. And I think they would also agree that the President, with less than 12 months left in his term, should not be the sole arbiter of what that future relationship looks like. It is precisely because a long-term security agreement would be controversial that the President should involve Congress in the deliberations that shape such an agreement. It is my understanding that the State Department regulations even call for consultations with Congress in that deciding what form an international agreement should take, the Department must expressly consider, quote, "the preference of the Congress to a particular type of agreement," unquote. The concern by many of us in the Congress is that the Declaration of Principles signed last November is so vague that it could cover anything from consulting with the government of Iraq about threats it faces to actually deploying U.S. troops to help Iraq defend itself. If all we are really talking about is consultation with Iraq's government in the face of a threat, then maybe an executive agreement is okay. But if the President intends to indefinitely commit U.S. troops to defend Iraq against future threats, then I believe the approval of Congress of any such agreement is required. Indeed, the American people would accept nothing less. So I call upon the President to reject General Lute's proposed course and instead instruct the State Department to consult with the relevant committees in Congress over the shape of our future relations with Iraq and what the exact nature of any future commitments will be. Trying to build a democracy in Iraq by ignoring the democratic process at home is ironic and certainly keeping with the habits of the President to date. But most of all, it is foolish, short-sighted, and perilous. It should not be done, and I suspect there could and would be serious consequences if that is attempted. Thank you, Chairman Delahunt.
Thank you, Chairman Ackerman. Now the distinguished ranking member on the Subcommittee on the Middle East, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this joint hearing. I am captured by a sense, though, that today may be a good example of how Congress can be a lagging indicator in American public life. It seems to me our discussion today here on Iraq misses the developments in 2007 altogether. It's almost as if the Anbar awakening didn't occur. It's as if we hadn't received preliminary reports of refugees returning home from neighboring countries, as if the last several months haven't been the safest for U.S. troops in years, or specifically the combat-related U.S. casualties in Iraq were not 83% less in December '07 than they were in December of 2006. It's as if the Iraq public doesn't have the precious breathing space that it lacked 1 year ago. In fact, it's almost as if the surge didn't work. But, Mr. Chairman, these things did occur. I'm not certain that this body has absorbed or appreciated the success story and the improved security situation in Iraq and how dramatically better conditions are. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who we all respect, and one not noted for overstatement, told the London Times on the 19th of January, quote, "We are in an immeasurably better place in January 2008 than in January of 2007. General Ray Odierno, the #2 commander of U.S. forces, said just this last Friday that Iraq's army and police will likely be ready to take over security in all 18 provinces by the end of the year. The day before that, the U.S. military reported that 75% of Baghdad is secure, a dramatic increase from 8% a year ago, before the surge began. Despite many predictions to the contrary, the surge succeeded and is succeeding. But one can't help but feel that, that good news is no news in certain quarters here on Capitol Hill. And I think it's important that we have this hearing today in the context of what's really happening. And frankly, contrary to some of the concerns raised about the President's intentions relative to a treaty or negotiations, I don't view with alarm that the President back in November signed a declaration with the Iraqi government pledging that both governments would form or endorse a long-term political or security pact. I don't see this as a blank check. Fred Kagan, who's testified before our committee, described in the Wall Street Journal last month, quote, "The joint American-Iraqi communique marks the beginning of normalization of relations between allies in a common fight against al-Qaeda and against Iranian efforts to dominate the Middle East." Chairman, in this light, I don't endorse putting the presence of our troops or our national interests in the hands of Iraqi voters. We don't covet the territory of Iraq any more than we did that of Germany, Japan, the Philippines, Korea, or Bosnia. Because of a successful mission completion, our long-term presence in those countries has been mostly non-controversial. Our vital national interests are advanced by a successful conclusion to our efforts in Iraq. A status of forces agreement is the first order of business for our negotiators. But I have one other concern. I am concerned about our dictating the terms of a potential treaty that may or may not be in the works. On its face, such an effort strikes me as something of a usurpation of the authority, of our authority rather, and not in keeping with Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress does not conduct bilateral relations with other countries under our Constitution. This isn't any fast-track authority we've created here. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 grants the President power to make treaties, subject to ratification by the Senate. Further, he has the constitutional authority to enter into an executive agreement. Professor Matheson points out this morning that, quote, Constitution does not give clear guidance as to what form must be used for what type of obligations or commitments. So are we preemptively demanding or disapproving a treaty in this body when we really have no role in treaties? It's a question I would ask. The administration has not indicated it would seek Senate approval for anything anyway. Are we attempting an unconstitutional legislative veto? With respect to the gentlelady who's present here today, H.R. 4959, the DeLauro bill, provides for congressional consultation. The language of the bill ensuring that the President produce a treaty that raises all these questions. Even if it's a sense of Congress, it strikes me as an unconstitutional solution in search of a problem. So I hope we have this conversation today. I'm interested in the testimony. I look forward to the dialogue, but I hope we do it in the context of a widening American success in Iraq, and I hope we also do it within the proper confines of the role of the House of Representatives in formation and implementation and ratification of treaties. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is indeed a very, very timely hearing. And I certainly want to say at the outset that we must not make the same mistakes that we made going into this conflict in Iraq as we attempt to determine how we conclude the matter. Now, I think it's very important for us to take a look at exactly the breadth and the scope of what the President wants to do by himself, without the consent of Congress, without the involvement of Congress. And I think when we look at this, I think it will illuminate the breadth and the scope of the arrogance of the president on one hand, and the direct failure of our responsibility as a Congress if we do not object and insist upon congressional approval. This is the mission as contained in the Declaration of Principle for this security agreement. This is what it says: to support the Iraqi government in training, equipping, and arming the Iraqi security forces so they can provide security and stability to all Iraqis. Support the Iraqi government in contributing to the international fight against terrorism by confronting terrorists such as Al-Qaeda, its affiliates, other terrorist groups, as well as all other outlaw groups, such as criminal remnants of the former regime, and to provide security, financial assurances to the Iraqi government to deter any external aggression and to ensure the integrity of Iraq's territory. Now, this is sweeping in its scope. It is soaring in its magnitude. And it requires the Congress of the United States to stand up and affirm its constitutional duties as outlined in the Constitution. It would be a considerable dereliction of our duties not to require that both houses of this Congress, by majority vote, approve of this agreement before we move forward, or else we will be a standing joke in the public opinion of the people who elected us to office. This is extraordinary, and I am just proud to be a part of this committee that is taking it upon ourselves to, I think today, strike the first blow for participatory government and democracy as laid out by Hamilton, by Matheson, and by Jay, that was laid out in Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States. We have a responsibility here, and we dare not shirk from this responsibility today. And I just hope, Mr. Chairman, that we are very strong in what we do, and that we send a very loud and a very purposeful message to the White House that this is not his job alone. We get out here every other year and run for office to get elected to perform our duties. And now the people of the United States is expecting us to perform it and make sure that before we approve any measure of how we wind this thing down in Iraq, that the Congress, not the President, but the Congress. And one other thing I want to say, Mr. President, why this makes this so timely is the fact that in all due respect to the President, he's here for 10 more months. We are the charge that the people of this country are looking to bring the correct conclusion to the matter in Iraq. And we must make the first bold step here this morning, and I commend you for taking the leadership to do so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Scott. And I'm going to ask the gentlelady from California, as a member of the full committee, if she will yield. I'll come back to her, to Ms. Delora, who I understand has a meeting someplace else, but we hope you return.
Thank you very,
Ms.
very
Delora.
much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to just say thank you to the Chairman Delahunt and to Chairman Ackerman for holding this hearing, and particularly to Mr. Delahunt for inviting me to participate. I also want to say thank you to my colleagues who day in and day out sit on this committee and for allowing me to participate. Our relationship with Iraq is undoubtedly one of the most critical issues facing our country today. With approximately 170,000 troops fighting in Iraq and the recent decrease in violence, much of the discussion concerning Iraq has turned to whether the troop surge is working. I welcome the reduction in violence, and I applaud General Petraeus and our troops. They make us proud. And I say to my colleague, Mr. Pence, this is not about the surge. This is about whether or not Congress should have a role. If our troops are to be present in Iraq to 2012 to 2018, that in fact is a long-term arrangement. As a matter of fact, the State Department in Circular 175 does call for consultation with the Congress in cases like these. I have long questioned our long-term strategy in Iraq. What is it? And how long do we plan on waiting for substantive Iraqi reconciliation? In June, Defense Secretary Gates said that we would have a, quote, long and enduring presence in Iraq. And he said that we would be borrowing from the Korean model and the security relationship that we have with Japan. He compared our relationship to the ones that we do have with Korea and Japan, two nations with which we have treaties. In November, the administration finally revealed its strategy when President Bush and Prime Minister al-Maliki agreed to a declaration of principles for a long-term U.S. relationship to be finalized by July 31st, 2008, just in the next several months. I am concerned about the security assurances that our nation plans on providing Iraq according to this declaration. Among other things, the declaration proclaims the parties' intention to negotiate a security arrangement, and I quote, to support the Iraqi government in training, equipping, and arming the Iraqi security forces so they can provide security and stability to all Iraqis. Support the Iraqi government in contributing to the international fight against terrorism by confronting terrorists such as al-Qaeda, its affiliates, other terrorist groups, as well as other outlaw groups, such as criminal remnants of the former regime, and to provide security assurances to the Iraqi government to deter any external aggression and to ensure the integrity of Iraq's territory. Sweeping commentary. The declaration appears in many ways to adopt the Maliki's government's definition of both external and internal threats. And that concerns me. What are these undefined threats? Would we be obliged to preemptively strike Sunni fighters beyond Iraq's borders, or even strike homegrown armed factions Maliki's own government deems to be a threat? After the principles were signed, as has been said already many times this morning, Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan, Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, said that he does not anticipate, and I quote, the status of the formal treaty, which would then bring us to formal negotiations or formal inputs from the Congress, end quote. Because the administration apparently believes Congress should not be involved in the negotiation of this agreement, I recently introduced the Iraq Strategic Agreement Review Act. The bill makes clear that the administration must consult with Congress and expresses the sense that any long-term security, economic, and political agreement with Iraq must come in the form of a treaty following approval from the Senate. We have been in Iraq for nearly 5 years. I understand that mapping out a future relationship with that country is vital to our national interest in the region. A clear majority of Americans still believe we should bring our troops home as soon as possible, and this Congress has been elected in large part out of dissatisfaction with this war. Congress has a central role to play in formulating any long-term relationship with Iraq. This president simply should not be permitted to unilaterally tie the hands of his successor. I look forward to hearing our witnesses today, getting their expert opinions on this type of agreement. I thank Mr. Delahunt and Mr. Ackerman for inviting me to this hearing, and I thank the witnesses in advance for sharing their views. As I must be at a press conference shortly, I don't know if I'll be able to hear Mr. Katzman's testimony, but let me just pose this question, and then I will leave my questions with Mr. Delahunt for the other witnesses. And I say to Mr. Katzman, in your testimony, you talked about an August 2007 communique signed by the top 5 political leaders, Shiites, Kurds, and Sunnis, as a springboard for this proposed agreement. Later in your testimony, you go through probable support or lack thereof for such an agreement in the parliament. I count at least 100 seats against. So is it quite possible that the Iraqi parliament would not be able to muster the seats to approve any treaty or agreement? I anticipate that their parliament is going through much the same considerations as we are today. What do you think the prospects are of the al-Maliki government ignoring the parliament, moving forward this agreement without approval? What would the ramifications of that be among the various sects in Iraq and on the Iraqi street? I thank the chair and for his indulgence in allowing me to speak before this hearing today, and I thank my colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Lauro. Let me now go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Ackerman, for allowing me as a member of the full committee to sit in on this subcommittee joint hearing. It is so important. You know, the first thing I have to do is respond to the gentleman from Indiana's statement that the surge is working. My response is, who said so? Because I want to know who's measuring how many of our troops are being wounded. Do you read how many wounded anymore? No. We're soon to be able to be reading that 4,000 of our troops have been killed. How many are wounded? How many are mentally damaged? And, you know, who's taking account of the number of Iraqis who are dead, who are dying, who are injured? How many of them, how many millions of Iraqis are refugees and continue to have to leave the regions that they live in, the country that is theirs? I don't consider the surge a success until we bring our troops home. Now, I'm not going to pile on about the very idea that the president, without congressional involvement, thinks he can come up with some agreement with any country, particularly Iraq, because it is wrong-minded, we know it, and we will insist that he come and work with us on this. If he has good ideas, the Congress should be glad to incorporate them in any agreement. But whatever that agreement is, I think it should include the provisions that have been expressed more than once. In fact, 10 separate bills that have included provisions to prohibit expressing opposition to the establishment of permanent military bases in Iraq. 5 bills have been approved by Congress in a bipartisan way, and the president has signed them into law. I want to know that they're going to be part of, what do you think, how they're going to be included in any agreement with the Iraqi government. But that needs to be what come back to us. It's proof in the pudding to me that whatever agreement is not going to be upheld in the first place, because we've done this 5 times. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm here to listen, I'm here to question, and I thank you for letting me.
Thank you, gentlelady. And would either our colleague from New York, Mr. Crowley, or our colleague from Florida wish to make any remarks? Crowley?
Mr. Chairman, only that it's always good to see you, and thank you for holding this event. At least one of those statements is accurate and true, but I do look forward to hearing the testimony of Dr. Katzman, and like my colleague, Ms. Woolsey, I'm interested in hearing his perspective on these issues, and we'll weigh in later on in the hearing. And no comment from my colleague from Florida. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Crowley, and I interpret your remark directed at me as a concern about February 3rd. It's the 3rd. That, by the way, for those who are unaware, is the day that the New York Giants meet the New England Patriots.
Can we call this a vote, Mr. Chairman?
No. Let me proceed. Our first panel today consists of just one witness, Dr. Ken Katzman of the Congressional Research Service. We don't have to be concerned that he is alone on this panel, because when it comes to Iraq and U.S. policy there, he is unique. As Thomas Jefferson said of Alexander Hamilton, he is a host unto himself. So we welcome you, Dr. Katzman, and would you proceed with your opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank both subcommittees for asking me to appear today. What I'm going to try to do is address the part of the title of the hearing, what will be in it. In other words, what might be the provisions of this bilateral agreement that's being negotiated. I would ask my testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I would note that my work at CRS is focused on U.S. policy toward Iraq, Iraqi politics, the insurgency, etc. I assert no expertise on the legal matters at issue or the separation of powers issues that have been raised, and I'll defer on those to the second panel. What I'm going to try to do is discuss what is at issue, what really is at issue. And as was said, the Declaration of Principles that was signed on November 26th flowed from an August 26 communique by 5 top political leaders of all ethnicities and sects. That was also the day it flowed from what was called a unity accord, where these 5 top leaders were trying to agree to some principles to move forward on political reconciliation. And they did agree to request or to give Maliki the ability to have this Declaration of Principles with the United States on a long-term strategic framework agreement. The framework agreement is intended to replace the current United Nations mandate under which U.S.-led forces contribute to the security of Iraq. The Iraqi leaders wanted this because Iraq has been under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, basically sanctions, and Chapter 7 means, in some sense, their sovereignty was not full because they were under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. The Iraqi leaders want full sovereignty. They want to be out from under the crimes or the bad times, as Ms. Rice said when she visited Iraq, Secretary of State Rice, of Saddam Hussein. They want to be out from under this Chapter 7 mandate. So they would like to move to a bilateral relationship, but recognizing that they cannot maintain security by themselves for the foreseeable future, as the Defense Minister, al-Ubaidi, who visited last week, has acknowledged. As I mentioned, Ms. Rice visited Iraq. She broke off from the President's Persian Gulf leg of his trip, and she went to Iraq. She, side by side with Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari, said that the draft strategic framework agreement that we're negotiating would be submitted to the Iraqi parliament for approval. So it is widely on record that the Iraqi government will submit this to its Council of Representatives, its parliament, for approval. I would like to discuss really what's at issue in this. If this Declaration of Principles of November 26 does indeed become a final agreement and all the provisions of the declaration are in it, what would it do? What would be in it? The judgment that the proposed pact will likely be long-term is, as I said, based on the provisions pertaining to security. The Declaration of Principles is that the United States would provide security assurances and commitments to Iraq to deter foreign aggression against Iraq that violates its sovereignty and integrity of its waters and airspace. And it goes further to potentially include United States support for the Iraqi government against internal threats. And the declaration, in many ways, adopts the Maliki government's definition of what the internal threats are. According to the declaration, the Iraqi government is combating terrorist groups, at the forefront of which is al-Qaeda, Saddamists, and all other outlaw groups, which it does not name these other outlaw groups. If a pact is negotiated in line with these principles, U.S. forces could conceivably be committed to combat any armed faction that the Maliki government or any future government defines as a threat to its security, without regard to why that armed group is fighting and whether or not the Maliki government has made best efforts to address the sources and causes of that armed opposition. Among the most significant implications in my analysis is the potential for Iraq and the United States to differ on their assessments of external threats to Iraq, and for Iraq to therefore assume U.S. support in a dispute with countries that the United States is allied with. Iraq's Kurdish leaders could, for example, try to assert that the United States, under a pact, is committed to confront Turkey over its military actions against the PKK Kurdish guerrillas, who have some safe haven in northern Iraq. Iraq's Shiite leaders could assert that the United States should act against Sunni Arab governments that are widely reported to be providing funds, arms, and transit to Sunni insurgents and the foreign fighters helping these insurgents. Some of them are close United States allies, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, for example. There is the potential for the current Iraqi government, widely considered to be dominated by pro-Iranian Shiite parties, to try to minimize the extent to which Iran is contributing to any violence inside Iraq. Another indication that a proposed pact would be a long-term commitment comes from, as I said, Defense Minister Ubaidi, who visited last week and told journalists, and General Dubik testified before the Armed Services Committee just this week, agreeing with these numbers, essentially that Iraq would not be able to secure its internal security until 2012. 2009 at the minimum, but the U.S. officials clearly think it will be the longer term of that range, and would not be able to defend against external threats until 2018 to 2020. I would like to discuss some of the specific stipulations. For example, the mission. The Declaration of Principles stipulates a mission. Now, General Lute, who was mentioned, says that the size and shape of a long-term presence would be part of the negotiations, and but he denied that any agreement would specify timelines or goals for the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. However, the declaration stipulation of the anti-terrorism and Iraq Security Forces training mission will likely color how many troops would be needed under the pact, if the pact is negotiated along the lines of the declaration. It is difficult to say precisely how many U.S. forces would be required to perform these missions. There are many intangibles. We don't know what the level of violence will be, the enemies, the threats, etc. My conversation with defense experts around town, the common thinking puts the range of U.S. troops for these missions at between 50,000 to 100,000, with many experts seem to be centered on 70,000. Again, not mentioning any names, many of these experts might not want to be held to these estimates, and that's what they are. They are estimates. The freedom of action for U.S. military forces will be key as to the provisions of this agreement. The degree, particularly the degree to which U.S. forces that are in Iraq under the pact must coordinate with or obtain Iraqi approval for specific combat operations. Some Iraqi observers say the Iraqi side might likely try to demand, for example, limits on the U.S. ability to employ airstrikes, potentially including the types of aircraft the United States could station in Iraq. The U.S. negotiating side is undoubtedly going to argue for the maximum flexibility for U.S. forces in any bilateral pact in order not to have their hands tied if they come under threat. It was mentioned a legal status of forces agreement will certainly be negotiated, but that is a component of this overall pact referring to whose law U.S. troops are under. Permanent basing. General Lute said there might be negotiations on permanent base. It was mentioned that several laws from Congress which were signed prohibit that. However, many Iraqi officials had said the Iraqi side is not going to want to allow permanent bases. So that may be an issue that is not confronted in the final agreement, because it appears the Iraqi side is leaning against permanent bases, quote unquote. The Declaration of Principles does not specifically provide how these issues would apply to coalition partners. Partner countries, we have about 11,500 partner forces in Iraq right now. How would it apply to them? I think it's reasonable to assume that there will be some provisions in any final pact that would provide for how partner forces are treated. At least 2 points in, again, the agreement has a security component, a political component, and an economic component. There are some points in the political section of the declaration that are of interest, I believe. In other words, the Declaration of Principles said the U.S. might be committed to support Iraq in defending its democratic system against internal and external threats. That stipulation could have major implications if there is a political upheaval that leads to the downfall of an elected Iraqi government. For example, would the United States be required to come restore the elected government? There's many, many permutations and implications depending on how that government fell, if it fell or not. Point 2 of the political section clearly also is of interest. It states the United States would assist Iraq in standing against any attempt to impede, suspend, or violate Iraq's constitution. The legalities of that could be complicated, but some might argue that this would allow the Iraqi government the right and responsibility to define who is attempting to impede, suspend, or violate Iraq's constitution, and could therefore compel the United States to act against activists in Iraq whose activities or political ideology might not necessarily conflict with U.S. interests, but they might conflict with the Iraqi government's definition of who's violating the Constitution. The economic section clearly has some commitments, if implemented in terms of the pact, in binding U.S. advisory help in the ministries, U.S. foreign assistance, and there is a provision that even stipulates that the U.S. would help Iraq formulate investment laws, and it specifically mentions to facilitate U.S. investment, among other investment. To just briefly, I want to just discuss in my testimony the Iraqi dynamics of this pact. As was asked in the opening statements, would this pass the Iraqi parliament? I think that's a very good question. Maliki can pretty much count on the support in a crunch of perhaps a little more than half of the Council of Representatives of 275. The Sadr bloc and a related bloc, the Fadila bloc, have broken with him this year. Many Sunnis certainly would not vote with him, and some secular blocs of former Prime Minister Iyad Allawi theoretically would vote against him as well. So it's not at all certain how the Iraqi parliament is going to vote on this agreement, and I think certainly the maneuvering of some of these blocs is going to determine how these issues are treated in the negotiations on a pact. I've stipulated who's against him, who's with him. It could be very difficult. It could break down to what's called nationalists versus decentralizers. Those in power now tend to favor power for individual regions. Those who tend to be against Maliki support more power for the central government of Baghdad. That's not completely how it breaks down, but in many cases it is. So I think I'm going to, as an expert, as an analyst on Iraq, I'm going to be looking at how some of the political blocs discuss or how they react as various provisions come out in the media during this phase of negotiations. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Katzman. It's my understanding that the extension of the mandate to the UN mandate to December 31st of this year was at the request of the Maliki government. Am I accurate on that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, the Security Council resolutions that started the mandate gave the Iraqi government the ability to make that request, and they went forward with the request.
Is there any prohibition that exists currently that would foreclose the extension of that mandate for, say, an additional 3 or 6 month period that you're aware of?
No, because, to my knowledge, no, because the security, if there's no, if there's no bilateral pact or any other vehicle that replaces the UN mandate, then theoretically, at the end of this year, the UN Security Council would meet to discuss extending the mandate. And
Because I raised the issue in light of the observations by Mr. Scott that this is an administration which has achieved lame duck status. The focus of the American people over the course of the next 8 or 9 months will be on the general elections in November, and that the potential for an agreement that would have no input from the next administration, I think, is a very real one. And he raises an interesting concern that I think is shared by many on both sides of the aisle. No one can predict, we can hope, but no one can predict what's going to occur on November 6th of this year in terms of an administration, the next administration. But clearly, if there was an agreement that was reached that was executive only, that required no input from Congress, despite a outpouring, if you will, of objections and criticisms, it could very well bind the United States government, the next administration, far into the future. Am I making accurate statements here?
if a pact along these lines was signed, with these missions stipulated, it could do that, would do that, sure.
I guess what I'm suggesting is that there is an option that I'm sure will be the subject of debate over the course of the next 8 or 9 months between the respective nominees of the parties, with the next president having to deal for a period of 4 years with the consequences of a Bush-Cheney agreement. And clearly, there are many who from the beginning have expressed their profound concerns about their handling of this war, and now for its aftermath to be imposed, if you will, on the American people while this particular administration exits from the stage, is something I think of grave concern. There has been some discussion about the surge this morning, and it's my understanding that the purpose of the surge was to provide the Iraqi political establishment to work on reconciliation. I don't see where that has occurred. And in my opening remarks, I noted that Iraq is still beset by factionalism that is severe, that continues to linger, and that any government, particularly the Maliki government, only represents one faction that appears to be in serious conflict with other factions. Have we had an agreement such as this where it's clear that there has been no movement, politically, and yet here we are entering into an agreement with a government that is rife with problems, that represents a particular segment of the political life of a country. Don't we usually wait till those issues have been clarified rather than exposing the United States to an unpredictable political changes?
Sir, I would say that many of the benchmarks that were set out have not been voted on and signed into law, have not become law. The de-Ba'athification law was passed. There are mixed reviews of it. The administration, I think, would argue there's been some local reconciliation. Some senior Sunnis in the national government are continuing to cooperate, particularly Tariq al-Hashimi, the deputy president. The budget has not been passed yet, but they are sharing revenue roughly. I think the basic rift in the society has not been healed. In other words, the Sunni Arabs still resent what has happened to them in the overthrow of Saddam and their new understatus in the political structure. That basic structure has not been resolved, yes.
But when one looks at the at that principle, which refers to external and internal threats against the government, how does that get interpreted if after a drawdown, if you will, the level of violence spikes up once more and we're bound by this agreement?
Yes, I think if the troop surge is reduced, and if Secretary Gates has said that he might want to get down to a level of about 100,000 U.S. forces by the end of this year. That hasn't been decided yet, but there is a decision to get down to about 130,000 by July. If indeed these resentments in the society then resurface, and the troop surge maybe has kept a lid on it for now, if indeed there is not this fundamental reconciliation, and if the violence spikes up again, it is possible, as I say, that the pact, this type of pact, would be interpreted by the dominant factions in power at the time and could potentially be used to have the United States go against their opponents. Yes, sir.
Well, I consider that a extremely vulnerable position for the United States to be hostage to, if you will. You indicated that the Foreign Minister Zabari has pledged publicly that the Maliki government would submit the draft agreement to the Iraqi parliament pursuant to their constitution. At an earlier hearing in which you testified and Mr. Rubin testified, my memory is that those same representations were made that the extension, the issue of the extension of the UN mandate, would be submitted to the Parliament. Was it submitted to the Parliament, Mr. Katzman?
No, it was not. That was the extension of the mandate.
It was not submitted to the Parliament, and my memory is that there was a letter from a majority, 144 members of the Iraqi Parliament, to the United Nations Security Council. Can you describe for us what was the import of that particular letter?
Well, the letter seemed to be, in my analysis, a coalescence of Maliki's opponents in the Parliament, who coalesced not only on that issue but on other issues, the oil laws and some other laws. These are factions that basically are against Mr. Maliki and his incumbency. Some of them are openly trying to topple Mr. Maliki. I would say Iyad Allawi, the former prime minister, is working every day as we speak right now to undermine and possibly unravel Mr. Maliki's government. They had requested that the UN rollover of the mandate be submitted to Parliament. This effort was led by the Sadr faction, who has broken with Mr. Sadr was Maliki's ally until the troop surge, at which time the United States basically told Mr. Maliki, we need to go against both Shia extremists and Sunni extremists. You must not protect Mr. Sadr's faction anymore. And Mr. Maliki was presented essentially, he said, okay, I will not go against the United States, and he allowed us to go against Mr. Sadr's militia, the Mahdi army, and Mr. Sadr broke with Maliki. And that letter was part of the repercussions of that break.
But the point is, there were 144 out of 275 members of the Iraqi parliament that expressed their concern or their lack of approval to the UN Security Council. And they had been told previously by the same foreign minister, Zubari, that any request for an extension would be submitted to the Iraqi parliament. They would provided those assurances, but the fact is it was never submitted.
Yes, sir.
And now we're to expect that we can rely on the representations of the same individual, Mr. Zubari and Mr. Maliki, that they will submit whatever agreement should come out of the discussions and negotiations between the Bush administration and the Maliki government to the Iraqi parliament.
Well, of course, not that I'm an expert on the Iraqi constitution, but I think it would be much more difficult for the Maliki government to argue that this pact would not meet the standards for their parliament to have to act. The UN rollover was, as we discussed at the last hearing, a little bit more debatable, but this pact, I think it would be very difficult for the Maliki government to argue that it does not meet the threshold for the parliament to act on it.
Let me go to my ranking member next, Mr. Robaca.
Thank you very much. Dr. Katzman, from your testimony, I take it that the agreement that got everybody so upset here is something that actually is motivated, clearly motivated by an attempt to move away from a government in Iraq that's based on a UN mandate. And isn't that what your testimony is?
Not necessarily that the government's based on the UN mandate, but that the U.S. presence in Iraq is based, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if we don't, if that government does not want to rest its security based on an arrangement with the United States on a UN mandate, this isn't something that's irrational for either side to want to have that agreement and to drift and to go away from simply having a UN mandate. Is that correct? I mean, you would think that would be a rational course of action.
Yes.
Okay, so what we have here is that this administration has decided that, and the current government in Iraq has decided that that's the best course of action, way to go. And what we have here is some distress on the part of people who fundamentally don't trust this administration. As I indicated earlier, I think that there is perhaps some basis for not trusting this administration, but who are expressing some concerns. And would you consider that their concerns are, as being expressed, are justified, or is this just as simple as you put it, just trying to take a step so that they can be free of dependence on a UN mandate?
That's, I think the concern that I, as an analyst, perhaps on Iraq, have is that we do have a sectarian difference of opinion in Iraq, and who's to say what's going to be in the final agreement? It could not come out as the Declaration of Principles have stipulated. It could be very different. What I think some would be concerned about is the degree of latitude that the declaration gave to the incumbent government in power in Iraq, which is a narrow government,
Yeah, but
to
would that
define who the enemy is.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is that it's the great concern is that this will bind us in the future. Now, there was a similar situation where the United States, a new administration, a Democratic administration, came in after a Republican administration and wanted to fundamentally alter what seemed to be the policy as bolstered by agreements and even treaties. And that was when President Carter came in and decided that it was going to abrogate the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan. Now, it's my understanding that the Supreme Court decided that indeed future presidents and future Congresses are not bound, and that they can indeed move in their own direction, so that this, what I would looks like to me to be an irrational fear that we are going to be set in cement forever, is not justified by the status of the legal rights of the president and the legal rights of the Congress, this one or the future presidents or Congresses. Is that correct?
Congressman, I'm going to defer that question to the next panel, since that seems to be more of a sort of a treaty law issue, if it's okay.
Yeah, it does seem to me that we shouldn't be as concerned to the point that it's irrational that we are going to be bound forever by a policy, but we should instead be focusing on what the policy should be and whether or not we disagree with that fundamental policy. Because I do believe that it's very clear that future presidents and future Congresses can go whatever direction they darn well want to go, and that President Bush, as positive or negative as people think that he is, that he is not going to be the dominant force in determining what the policy is of the next administration. We will go our way, and whether it's a Democrat or a Republican administration. Now, about that policy, let me just note that I, for one, would be very opposed to any policy that would try to establish that America will have long-term military installations in Iraq. First, they aren't needed because we've got other military installations in the Gulf where people want us. And second of all, it sends exactly the wrong message. I believe the Iraqi endeavor has been somewhat benevolently motivated. And I know that is something that people on the other side of the aisle don't necessarily agree with. In fact, I think they find that they're trying to find maliciousness in the motives for us going into Iraq. I don't find that at all. And I think that trying to have some sort of an agreement that would give us a right to some long-term military presence in Iraq feeds that paranoia, and that indeed there's some unspoken malicious motive behind America's engagement in Iraq. I believe what we're trying to do here is what we tried to do during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we had to make sure that there weren't gains by the communists and their allies that would encourage the type of aggression that would lead to conflict and lead to great loss of freedom and a disruption of the peace. And in today's world, where radical Islam is a major threat. I believe that what we were basically trying to do in Iraq was to at least demonstrate some sort of alternative to radical Islam in the Muslim world. That does not, however, justify us doing all the fighting and carrying all of the burden as perhaps we did and perhaps the American people did during the Cold War. My father fought in Korea, and I cannot tell you how many times over dinner he told me that had he known that, and all the men who were in Korea who were fighting there against that communist aggression, had they known or had anyone told them that there would be American troops stationed in Korea 50 years later, he always said, we would have told them they were crazy. And there would be no American troops in Korea, and that would have been a crazy notion for Americans to have a military presence in Korea for 50 years. I think that that deserves a lot of discussion. I think that policy deserves discussion. And I don't believe the American people want us to have a military presence, but and if there are people who want us to have a military presence in Iraq for 50 years, let's discuss it. I don't believe that what we're talking about here is motivated by trying to sneak in a backdoor commitment that will require the United States to have this long-term military commitment. I think it's just as you state, this is a very rational approach that they're trying to move away from a mandate of the United Nations, which is something that puts us on a totally different footing than if we have a mutual agreement. Just for the record, I would oppose any mutual agreement that would suggest that the United States should re-enter Iraq in the future if Iraq is, just because Iraq needs us. The people of Iraq are the ones who have to control their own destiny. The people of Iraq have to stand up, or they will not be free and they will not have democratic and honest government. We are giving them a chance to have democratic and honest government now. American blood and treasure is being expended to give them that opportunity. We can be proud. I believe we can be proud of that. But in the future, if they're not able to defend their own country, absent of some major invasion from another country, then they're the ones who will have to bear the responsibility and not the people of the United States. So with that said, I thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I do not find the issue at hand to be as ominous as some of the presentations would have us believe.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbach. I now the chair of the Bill Subcommittee, Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you very much, Chairman Delahunt. My dad fought in World War II. If he were around today, he'd still be amazed that we still have troops in Germany. Of course, they're there under different circumstances, and things do happen, things do change, and they're certainly not unwelcome there. It's part of a different overall picture. Mr. Katzman, Dr. Katzman, traditionally our first panel would ordinarily be witnesses from the administration. Were they willing to participate, which Chairman Delahunt described the attempts to get them here, and they have all declined. So you sit as the first panel, certainly not representing the administration, but nonetheless have a great degree of expertise.
Mr. Ackerman, would you just yield for a moment?
Surely.
I intend, after this hearing, to sit with you and see whether we can determine a convenient date so that we could reissue those invitations, given that in the aftermath of this particular hearing, and call upon the administration to fully explain their position and clarify how they intend to proceed. With that, I yield back, and thank you.
I'd welcome the opportunity at that and any opportunity to sit down and discuss that with you and to issue such an invitation. And perhaps we can invite our ranking members on the other side of the aisle to sit with us as we do that. Reference was made before to our relationship, I believe, by Mr. Rohrabacher to the situation as it evolved with Taiwan. That was rather unique in its happenstance, as during that time, Taiwan was in effect being decertified by us and the international community of their nationhood as we replaced them in the UN in our foreign policy with mainland China. Nonetheless, having been our partner and ally, we had an obligation to deal with them despite the fact of their soon-to-be sui generis situation. And in their uniqueness of not being a country, in some of the legal parlance, having a treaty with an entity such as a non-country was something very, very different. And therefore, the relationship that governs our policy towards Taiwan developed by indeed an act of Congress, which was the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed into law, and together with a series of letters that were exchanged with Taiwan, have governed that relationship ever since. I point that out because I believe it's important to the discussion that we're having today, and that relationship and those documents and that law has not been changed. And I think it has led to the stability between the parties in the region to understand what that relationship is, which calls for not the defense of Taiwan, as some misinterpret the reading of that, on all sides of all of the oceans and seas involved, but call for providing for the defense of Taiwan and to do all in our power so that they can provide for their own defense. And I think there's a slight misreading of some of the documents with relationship to Iran that we're discussing today as to what our obligations would be, although that is still fuzzy nonetheless. I want to take a different path than some of our colleagues in their view of this, and find myself in the unique position from this side of the aisle defending the prerogatives of the administration. As much as I dislike and detest the fact that the administration tries to usurp the powers and prerogatives of the legislative branch of government, I find it equally offensive if we should try to denude the administration of what their authorities are. And I think that this Congress legally, and I know that's the purview of the next panel, but Dr. Katzman, you do have some thoughts and historical references that you can help us with in this. If we were to try to remove the prerogatives that the administration has, we have no right under the Constitution to insist that the administration negotiate a treaty. We can make the arguments, but we have no basis in law to compel that. The administration can have agreements, does have agreements with other countries. And that is certainly within the rights of the administration, and certainly there are many historical references that we could make to that happening where it has worked very, very successfully. That's the purview of the administration. We should not be attempting to try to take that away from the president. But the Constitution does provide, does insist, does assert that the administration has a responsibility, and it's in the Constitution, to consult with us not for us to consult with Dr. Katzman, as brilliant as he is. He cannot substitute for the administration that should be sitting here with us today and has deliberately absented themselves from that process, and that's what has me irked. But in response to that, we should not say, as it does in the Delora bill, that the administration must proceed by law, nor do we have the constitutional authority to do that. I think we have to make the compelling arguments that they be here and that they consult with the appropriate committees of the Congress. But to compel them to make this a treaty obligation rather than take any other foreign policy path would be equally wrong and as misguided of us to insist upon that as it is for them to insist that we do not exist in coming to this conclusion. It would be very wrong-headed of the administration to try to do that. Where I have a slight disagreement with my friend from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is that I do think it's important that we not whimsically, as we change Congresses, to go back on agreements, even though not of a treaty status, but of an administration, government-to-government agreement, and look as if we were whimsical in our foreign policy and can change it every 2 years as the Congress might change. One of the faults that we have in dealing with the Palestinians, if we shift to yet a different part of the world, is that the Hamas refuses to recognize agreements that their previous governments have made with the Israelis. That treaties or agreements or obligations of an international nature, witnessed at very high-profile levels in various places in the globe, including here in Washington, do not exist because they then took a majority in their parliamentary elections. That is what unreliable parties to agreements do, and we as the United States should not do that just based on a whim, a will, or a notion, or a change of parties in control of Congress. There should be a very substantial reason if that is to be done. And I would not take unseriously the administration negotiating something as far as a policy agreement with Iran, and because the Democrats rather than the Republicans are in control, or whoever next time, and just say, well, that doesn't exist, we're going to pass something else and negotiate something else. That does not make us a responsible, respectable, reliable partner when it comes to foreign policy, and that's the last thing that we need to do, is further upset the faith and credit, whatever that might be, as a residual existing in the world. Dr. Katzman, is there, there seems to be a question in Iran, and I don't profess to be an expert in their constitution, but there does seem to be a question, at least over there, as to whether or not their parliament has to ratify any agreement. It seems that the foreign minister thinks that they'd be hard-pressed not to allow that to happen. Mr. Maliki thinks that it's not going to happen. I guess administrations think that they're the only people in their respective capitals, whether they be here or there. But it certainly would be unwise on our part to get into a war that was not supported and understood by the American people, and it would not be sustainable, even though popular at the moment in this country. And I think on their part, it would probably be equally unwise, as it would be in any other country, to negotiate a long-term relationship that's going to govern their prospective existence as far as who their daddy is, that is not acceptable to the people of that country. Is there any historical notation that this kind of thing can work, where leaders have agreements that the people on both sides might disagree with?
I think my comment on that would be Maliki has not said he does not believe this shouldn't be submitted to the Council of Representatives. My perception is he's on board with going to the Parliament, and Zabari, the Foreign Minister, reflected that he has not tried to argue that this should not be taken to the Iraqi Parliament.
Is it your understanding that it will or will not pass if it were brought before their Parliament?
If what's negotiated is along the lines of the Declaration of Principles, my judgment as an Iraq expert is that it would have tremendous difficulty passing the Council of Representatives. Yes, sir.
And if it didn't pass, it wouldn't take effect?
Correct. Presumably. Presumably. I say that because if they submit it to the Parliament and they have a vote and it doesn't pass, I don't see how they would argue that they would just unilaterally begin to implement it.
Which is probably the resistance on the part of Mr. Maliki to submit it, even though he has not said he would not do so.
I'm not, he resisted the UN rollover. He did not present the UN mandate rollover last December to the Parliament. He is not, there's no indication that he's resisting or in any way does not want it submitted. There's a suspicion among some Iraqi factions that disagree with Mr. Maliki that he might try to go around the Parliament, but I've seen no indications that he's planning or scheming to circumvent the Iraqi Parliament on this.
If there were some secretary or deputy or undersecretary sitting where you sit right now, I would be one from this side who suggested to them that we do not want a failed post-war relationship with the Iraqis, as I'm sure no American Democrat, Republican, whatever, would want. And it would behoove the administration to try to get as many of us on board by trying to listen to what we think might be helpful, because they, Mr. Secretary, you, who are not here, are not the font of all wisdom in coming to these kinds of conclusions, and maybe someone else can have a decent notion, whether it be from the Republican or Democratic side of the microphone.
Mr. Congressman, what I suspect is going to happen, and I may be speculating here, but I suspect that as these negotiations go forward, both sides will shape the eventual text in such a way that either it will pass the Council of Representatives or it would be perhaps less controversial than the Declaration of Principles would have us believe that it might be. But in my testimony, I'm talking strictly to the Declaration of Principles because that's all we have written down at this point. But I suspect it's going to be modified in such a way that perhaps it does pass the Council of Representatives.
Well, hopefully we'll have similar discussions with our administration to bring the same kind of democratic process that we expect of the Israelis, of the Iranians, to in having discussions between their administration and their parliament to come to a conclusion that's acceptable to the majority of the Iraqi people and making as much sense out of it. And if we had that here, we would have a much stronger, more understandable and more acceptable by the American people that would bridge the gap from administration to administration without everybody jumping to undo what somebody else might have done. Dr. Katzman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Ackerman. Mr. Scott of Georgia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to say I'm sorry that the gentleman from California is not here, Mr. Rubin, who made the statement that this is not a backdoor attempt for a long-term engagement in Iraq. And I concur with him. It is not a backdoor. This is coming straight at us through the front door. But make no mistake about it, to do the mission and what is laid out in this agreement will obligate us to, at the least, an indefinite future. And I think the thrust of my questions is on, and I'm not arguing what the end product will be. I'm arguing the process. If the President of the United States could come to Congress and ask for congressional authority and authorization to commit our resources and troops to invade Iraq, most assuredly, that same principle works to come to Congress to determine a declaration of agreement as we attempt to determine what we do in the future in Iraq. And that is the rub here. And until that bridge is crossed, we will not be able to cross this ravine in any intelligent manner. So it is very important that we get this across, that this is a two-way street. And I want to thrust my points to you, Mr. Katzman, if you could work with me a little bit here, as to why, very technically and structurally, this has to happen. First of all, we're talking about a commitment of troops. Whether we like it or not, we're talking about some kind of military presence going forward if we're going to be there to do, as it says in the mission, to ensure the integrity of Iraq's security, to help the Iraqi government to deter any external aggression. The other point about this measure is this is far different than South Korea and in large measure even Germany, World War II. For when we deal with Iraq and where we're going with that, we're just not dealing with Iraq. We're dealing with the most volatile region that has a cascading effect, a domino effect. For every action we do, there's a reaction in Iran, there's a reaction in that whole region. So this is a very, very serious matter. And I just want to make my point clear here, because in this agreement, the United States will acquire certain obligations under international law and could be in default of those obligations unless there is implementing legislation from here in Congress. So we have no choice in the matter, and that is so puzzling with the arrogance that I was speaking about earlier. The White House did not even realize this. Why would we even want to get into this mess in the first place? It would have no sanctions. The other thing is that this worries me greatly because it is nothing more than an extension of a blank check. And here we've got the President of the United States, as I said before, who has only 10 months left in office, who is not just passing this on to the next president, the next administration, and the next Congress when we come in 2009, but he's in effect handing a blank check to Maliki. This is where this president, how irresponsible. And as was pointed out, we could wind up, Maliki could say the PKK is where we need to go to defend, and we wind ourselves, as you pointed out, attacking Turkey. We're leaving it up in the hands of this. This is why this is such a very, very serious problem. And I want to get your comments on that point in terms of the implementing legislation, the obligations that we will be obligated to under international law, and the blank check that we're giving to the Maliki government.
The legal issues, if it's okay, I'm going to have to leave to the second panel since that's not my expertise. But I think what I tried to reflect in my testimony is the Declaration of Principles is really, to my mind, about the Maliki government. It's not necessarily, it is U.S.-Iraq relations. It's about our relations with Iraq, but the wording of it is all about the Maliki government and how much power would be given to not only Maliki, but any future government to determine who U.S. troops go after, for example. It's perfectly conceivable that in order to get Mr. Sadr's support, and I believe Sadr's support would be crucial to having this pass in the Iraqi Council of Representatives. I think if Mr. Sadr's faction does not support it, I think it will have difficulty in the Council of Representatives. It's perfectly conceivable that to gain his support for this, there might have to be some provision that U.S. forces do not chase his Mahdi militia. That's perfectly conceivable. I'm not saying that will be the outcome, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to argue that Mr. Sutter is going to want something in return for voting for a pact like this. The Sunni Arabs, I think they see from the wording of this, where it refers to Saddamists, etc. Most Sunni Iraqi Arabs would say that this is directed against them. This is against them. This is what I'm hearing. I talk to Iraqis. Their view is this is against them. And this is what I tried to get across in my testimony. But I'll limit my expertise to that, if it's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Costa of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In listening to the comments by my colleagues here, I guess I want to further explore the nature of this proposed agreement, not so much as what's in it or what should be in the treaty, but the timeline that was discussed at some length by my colleagues in their questions. If, in fact, the administration reaches some sort of an agreement, what would be the binding nature, in your view, into the next administration and the next Congress? I mean, we have agreements with many countries, and as was noted here in earlier questions, they change. They change as circumstances change in that part of the world where those agreements are, and they change from administrations to Congresses. And the flexibility in an agreement as to what is in fact, which commitments are kept and which are not kept. I mean, just as an example, I believe there was some discussion as to whether or not bases are permanent or not permanent. I mean, frankly, I think that's almost a discussion that really doesn't bear real merit, because frankly, you can call a base temporary, and it can be temporary for 30 years. So under the, determining how you define it. So I guess I would like you to respond as to your nature or your sense as to an agreement that is reached, and if it doesn't have the imprimatur of the Congress, what changes the next administration or the next Congress could pursue.
Sir, if it's okay, I'm going to, again, defer that to the next panel, which will deal with the legal issues. But to talk about the timeline, the intention is to have it inked, have a pact agreed to by July 31, and then presumably there would be time for the Iraqi parliament to ratify, to review it, ratify it in time for the expiration of the current United Nations mandate, which would be December 31st of this year.
And you believe the Iraqi parliament could meet such a deadline based upon their track record?
Well, if, as I suspect, it's going to be there's going to be political consultations in Iraq as it's being negotiated, and if what's agreed to has already been sort of, in many ways, vetted by the major blocs, the major political blocs, it's conceivable they could act fairly quickly on it.
Dr. Katzman, how would you rate this priority within the Iraqi parliament compared to reconstruction, compared to de-Baathification, compared to the implementation of getting revenues out to the provinces? I mean, where does this fit?
My analysis would be that this would be a very high priority, because many of the political blocs see in a potential agreement like this, they will be interpreting whether they are going to be the subject or the object of U.S. combat operations, and they will take it very, very seriously, sir.
On that basis, how do you think this plays into the current agreements that are being reached between the U.S. military and the various Sunni parties in Anbar with the sheikhs and this other process that, trying to think of the term of what we call it now.
The Awakening Council.
Right, the Awakening Council.
Concerned local citizens, yes, sir. Well, that could very well play into it. You know, as we said at the last hearing, Sunni opinion is increasingly divided. If one had asked a year or two ago, how would the Sunnis view it, one would say they would be united against something like this. Now it's much less clear because they are, some of them, these groups that you mentioned, have come into some understanding with the United States.
And reaching sidebar agreements of some kind.
Yes, but the issue is those awakening councils and those movements, tribal movements, they are not much represented in the Iraqi Council of Representatives. These are Sunnis who have come forward after the elections. They did not compete in the elections. They did not have party slates. So they would not, the people, nobody really representing that group is in the Council of Representatives at this time.
But a group that does have representation in the council, and there was reference made earlier to it, I think, by Mr. Ackerman, the Kurds, they obviously have their own agenda, and as it relates to, I mean, I think they are a group that probably, my sense is, has a plan A, has a plan B, and who knows, they may have a plan C. How does this play into their agenda?
The Kurds would almost certainly be as supportive of this as possible because they know they will not be the subject of U.S. combat operations.
And they won't try to leverage it?
Well, they might, yeah, they might try to leverage it against Turkey or somebody else. That's different, but they, yes, they might try to leverage it, but they would be highly supportive of an agreement along these lines.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm just going to wrap up and see if there's any other questions or comments by members before we let you go. But, you know, in response to Mr. Costa's observation about Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, it would appear that the only group or institution, if you will, that doesn't have a plan because they're in the dark is the United States Congress. No consultation, no reaching out. You indicated that it's your understanding, Dr. Katzman, that there are conversations going on in Iraq among the various blocs, including blocs in their parliament, regarding a proposed agreement. It's being vetted, and yet the United States Congress sits here without a clue. Without a clue. I guess that is disturbing, particularly as I indicated, according to, and we'll get into this with the next panel, according to their own rules and regulations, there ought to be consultation going on, and we can't even secure the appearance of appropriate individuals from the administration to educate us and inform us and to consult with us. Can you, maybe you've heard some, maybe you have some information as to what the status is currently in terms of discussions, negotiations, however you want to describe it, between the Bush administration and the Maliki government. Do you have any information?
Nothing really detailed. I mentioned that Defense Minister Ubaidi was here last week. My understanding is that that was sort of laying the groundwork for the beginning of these negotiations, but they'll begin in earnest next month.
They'll begin in earnest next month, meaning February.
I believe so, yes.
So if we're to achieve the goal of July, there's actually 4 or 5 months.
That's my understanding, sir, yeah.
So 4 or 5 months of discussions between the two executives in an effort to design a blueprint that will, for an indefinite period of time, describe the relationship between the United States and Iraq without any input or consultation to date with the United States Congress in 5 months?
Yes, however, of course, a lot of negotiating went into the Declaration of Principles of November 26. I mean, so
So you would describe
political
that as preliminary talk and...
the political framework has been built. Yeah.
You know, I just want to conclude, 'cause I think it's really an important observation or statement that you made. In your written testimony, you make this statement: U.S. forces could conceivably be committed to combat any armed faction that the Maliki government defines as a threat to its security. You stated this agreement is about the Maliki government. And yet, my memory is that there are some armed factions that have been affiliated at different times with the Maliki government that have been problematic, if you will, to the security in Iraq. Do you have any examples of armed factions that today are allied with the Maliki government, but in the past have been defined by the administration and others as threat to security? Do you know of any examples?
Not really, because the Sunni movements that we just talked about were never affiliated with Mao. They were never supportive of him at any time.
Mr. Scott?
Yeah, I just have one final question I want to ask. This is pending before Maliki's government. Their parliament will have to decide upon this. What if the message goes out, irregardless of whether we're debating, we'll debate the legal requirements of what our role in Congress should be legally in terms of what the president can do. But certainly there's one thing we can do by the Constitution, that is appropriate the funds. It's clear to me in reading whatever it is, and Malachi will read this very clearly, what impact or what would be the reaction over there if they have the opinion coming from what I think is a majority opinion of Congress, and on both sides of the aisle, I think to some measure, that Congress will not appropriate the fundings going forward for this. What would be the reaction over there?
If this was signed and Congress did not appropriate funds?
Well, yeah, well, I'm saying they have to vote on this. I mean, there's a vote coming up on this agreement with Maliki in the parliament. He has to get approval. But if a signal is coming from this country that the Congress, irregardless of what, at this point, the Congress is saying if they're not involved in this, I mean, there's not going to be any funding coming forward to fund this agreement. We don't have to wait on a ruling from the Constitution or legal authorities there. We've got the power of the purse. And this Declaration of Principles requires the allocation of resources and appropriation of funds. And if there is a message going forward here, which I think that there is, that Congress is very hesitant to authorize funds for this, what ramifications does that have over there? And also, given the July deadline that we have, because I will tell you this, the American people are not going to stand for this, number one, until there is some reconciliation. And for the very fact that State Department representatives themselves refuse to come before our committee. They should be receiving our comments. That's a bad sign. And I'm just saying that from your perspective, what does this read for, how will it be interpreted?
My analysis would be that if we sign an agreement along these lines with Iraq and the Council of Representatives ratifies it on their end, but it, for whatever reason, is not either approved here or implemented here, there would be severe repercussions for the Iraqi government, possibly to include its possibly to include its collapse, although I don't want to speculate, but I think the repercussions for the Iraqi government would be severe.
Would it send a signal to them that they could get on the side of making sure beforehand? My point is, if a message is sent loud and clear, that there could be some pressure brought from Maliki to this administration that unfortunately we're not able to bring to this administration to involve Congress before we get to that point. Because I understand, I think, from your July deadline, something has to happen. Is that correct? We have to have something in place by then to replace the UN mandate? Is that correct? What is it? Explain the July.
The plan is to have an agreement along these lines signed or agreed by July.
And if not?
Then the
It will
UN
continue.
mandate stays until December 31, so that's really the deadline. Although it could be renewed. If there's no agreement, either the Iraqis don't ratify it, or for whatever reason it's not agreed here, the UN mandate the UN Security Council would have the option of meeting and renewing the mandate for another year or less than a year, or whatever period of time they want to. They can extend the UN mandate.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Your points are well taken. And thank you, Dr. Katzman, for your customary lessons. And we appreciate it. And let me call forward our second panel. We have two distinguished witnesses, Professor Michael Matheson of the George Washington University Law School and Dr. Michael Rubin of the American Enterprise Institute. Professor Matheson served for 28 years in the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor, where he was acting legal advisor for 2 years with the rank of ambassador. He led efforts within the U.S. government to create the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda and the UN Compensation Commission for the Gulf War Compensation. When it comes to questions about treaties, I'm pleased to say that we have the right man in the right room at the right time. Welcome, Professor. And our other witness is Dr. Michael Rubin, who previously appeared before our subcommittee last December. And he is an expert on Middle East politics, who worked in the office of the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, from 2002 to 2004, both as the desk officer for Iran and Iraq and as an on-the-ground advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. Dr. Rubin holds a Ph.D. from Yale and is a senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School. Dr. Rubin, we welcome you back.
Thank you.
And why don't we begin with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Matheson,
Okay.
Ambassador Matheson.
Thank you very much. Chairman Delahunt, Chairman Ackerman, honorable members, thank you for this opportunity to testify. This hearing seeks to determine whether any proposed U.S. security commitment to Iraq should constitute a treaty. It is an important question, but there is no cut and dry answer. Too much depends upon the content of the agreement. Among the principles outlined by President Bush and Prime Minister Maliki in their Declaration of Principles were provision of security assurances and commitments to the Republic of Iraq to deter foreign aggression against Iraq that violates its sovereignty and integrity of its territories, water, or airspace, support for the Republic of Iraq in its efforts to combat all terrorist groups, consistent with mechanisms and arrangements to be established in the bilateral cooperation agreements, and support for the Republic of Iraq in training, equipping, and arming the Iraqi security forces to enable them to protect Iraq and all its peoples, and completing the building of its administrative systems in accordance with the request of the Iraqi government. On December 18, 2007, the Security Council passed Resolution 1790, which extended the multinational force Iraq mandate until December 31, 2008. Throughout this year, the U.S. and Iraqi government will negotiate the details of a security agreement to replace the UN's Chapter 7 mandate. The details are crucial to the question at hand, but remain unclear. The proposed agreement could take many forms and indeed could be a package of multiple agreements ranging from a status of forces agreement, a so-called SOFA, to economic development packages, to basing agreements, to formal defense treaty. SOFAs apportion rights and responsibilities between a host government and our stationed or deployed forces. Typically, they serve to vest the United States with criminal jurisdiction over our forces in a host country. Usually, this entails a commitment to hold our troops and personnel legally responsible for any criminal conduct under the Uniform Code of Military Justice or some such arrangement. Unknown in the case of Iraq would be the status of private security contractors. Many SOFAs also address exemption from inspections and custom duties, travel document requirements, and tax exemptions for the PX. Today, the United States has approximately 100 SOFAs. Generally, SOFAs constitute agreements rather than treaties. It is a rare occurrence if a SOFA is sent to the Senate for approval. With regard to NATO, Japan, and Korea, security guarantees are covered in separate treaty structures above and beyond the SOFA itself. For example, in 1953, the United States and the Republic of Korea signed a mutual defense treaty, which the Senate ratified in 1954. The Pentagon then negotiated in 1966 a SOFA, which came into force on February 9, 1967, with an exchange of letters rather than a separate ratification. To determine whether ratification is necessary, what an agreement is called is less important than its contents. There is a point that an agreement can go so far in obligating the United States to defend another country that the Senate should ratify it. That line is when the obligation to defend another country becomes legally binding under international law. If such language is embedded in an Iraq SOFA, then there's little question that the SOFA should be voted on as a treaty by the U.S. Senate. It is possible that the White House will stress that they consider any pact with security guarantee language to be an agreement rather than a treaty, and so not legally binding to the extent a treaty would be. Should the White House try to adhere to this fine line, however, the Iraqi government would take note and consider the U.S. commitment ephemeral and perhaps demand a more formal treaty. Basing agreements are more nebulous and controversial. The differentiation within U.S. discourse between permanent and non-permanent bases is more political than legal. For the United States to establish or lease a base in another country often requires an agreement rather than a treaty. Many of these basing agreements or the renewal agreements involve political or economic commitments. This has been the case, for example, with the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. Ankara frequently requests economic incentives. During the 2005 renegotiation, the Pentagon sought a blanket agreement in which the U.S. military would have full use for the period of the agreement, while some Turkish officials demanded that Ankara be able to approve every flight in order to maintain their leverage over congressional discussions of the Armenian Genocide Resolution and other issues. Rent was the major subject of the U.S. Kyrgyz base renewal talks in 2006, while expansion of the facilities to provide better force protection became the issue dominating discussions to expand Camp Lamanier in Djibouti. Sharing of maintenance costs for U.S. facilities in Japan is the contentious issue in U.S.-Japanese negotiations. Sometimes host countries wish to receive security guarantees in exchange for hosting a U.S. base or U.S. forces. Again, whether or not the basing agreement should be subject to Senate ratification depends upon the strength of the guarantee. Such demands for assurances are not always stated up front and often enter the conversation over years or during renewal discussions. It is not the House Foreign Affairs Committee's duty to preempt negotiations over specific clauses of an agreement not as yet written, but it will become the Senate's duty to ratify the resulting product should it include security guarantees binding under international law. It is ironic that the House Foreign Affairs Committee seems more intent on defending the Senate's prerogative than the Senate itself. As our diplomats and military officials negotiate such an agreement, they will be seeking to underline our commitment to Iraqi stability and that country's success fighting the extremists and terrorists that threaten both Iraqi and U.S. security. They will seek to preserve our military's maneuverability. While some critics of the Bush administration's Iraq policy suggest that the United States should confine itself to a limited number of forward operating bases, FOBs, or even redeploy its forces over the horizon into neighboring countries or Iraqi Kurdistan, Such a strategy would hamper our ability to respond and protect the U.S. forces training Iraqi counterparts and providing the space for Iraqi politicians to advance reconciliation efforts. The insurgency spread when U.S. forces were confined to a handful of FOBs. Part of General Petraeus and General Odierno's surge strategy involved saturating troops throughout their areas of operation. The strategy worked. U.S. and Iraqi negotiators will not be anxious to roll back success by again concentrating multinational forces to a few FOBs, but will rather seek to maintain the security regime until political reconciliation can occur. Any language, however, which would commit U.S. forces to defend Iraq in the face of an external threat would transform the agreement into a treaty subject to Senate ratification. In such a case, not only would the eyes of Tehran and Damascus be on the U.S. Senate, but also observers in Taipei, Jerusalem, and Seoul. For the U.S. willingness to support and defend our allies, regardless of where we are in the election cycle, is at the heart of our credibility and our relationships not only in Iraq, but the world over. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. And we have 2 votes scheduled. So we're going to defer the testimony from Mr. Matheson upon our return. There are 2 votes. I would expect that within a half an hour, we'll be back in our seats and look forward to your testimony and look forward to the question and answer format. And with that, we'll recess.